Hello and welcome to Take Me Home, the podcast offering a social democratic alternative for the politically homeless. My name is Sebastian Moore.
And I'm hilary.salt.
And today we are delighted to be joined by Professor David Paton, who is, I want to say, a professor in industrial economics at Nottingham University Business School. Have I got that right, David?
You've got that exactly right, yeah. It's
Very
a pleasure
good.
to be with you as well.
And we thought we'd start off with perhaps the obvious question. What is industrial economics?
So industrial economics is economics applied to the study of firms, companies and industries. So for those of you who know your economics, you've probably heard of macro and micro. Industrial economics probably focuses a bit more on the micro, looking at firm decisions, but obviously within the context of policy. So how does government policy affect things like exports and imports, productivity growth, and so on. And we've got a long tradition at University of Nottingham of having two separate economics departments. So I'm in the industrial economics department and there's another school of economics over on another campus as it happens. So there's a long tradition here at Nottingham. We've got an industrial economics degree, which is very successful. We interpret it very broadly. So you can think of it as just economics, but very broadly applied to how firms and industries and the economy might do better.
But when we invited you on the podcast, David, I'd said maybe we could talk about industrial strategy. And you said, I'm not very keen on industrial strategies. Do you want to just explain that?
I'm a little bit sceptical. So the idea of industrial strategy can mean lots of different things. And, at one level, it's talking about government identifying winners and losers in the economy and making decisions about where to invest. And it can be a bit different to that. But I think my view is that governments don't have a great track record when it comes to that sort of approach. And we can think of the big industrial policy that we've had over the past 20 years has been in energy. Now, you can't avoid government having an energy policy. It's has all sorts of implications for infrastructure, for companies and so on. And it has to be directed by government. But you look at that area where the government has to be involved, I would argue it's probably the worst performing area we've had over the past 20 years. We've now got the highest energy prices for industrial companies in Western Europe, arguably, close to the highest in the world. It's high for domestic consumers as well. There's all sorts of reasons I'm sure we'll get into later on about net zero and policy and so on. But that's that really big area that underpins everything else in terms of industries has not been a success at all. Now, as I said, you can define this in different ways. So the idea that governments can play a role in setting the right environment for companies is in itself an industrial strategy. So thinking about, whether we should be within the EU or not in the EU, or what our relationship should be, what the tax structure should be for companies, looking at national infrastructure levels, they're all areas where the government has to be involved. And if you want to say that sort of set of policies is some sort of industrial policy, then fine, that's something we have to do. And I'm not agreeing. But I think generally when we talk about this industrial policy, and there's been a bit more talk about this from the Labour government over the past few years, tends to be more about the government trying to sort of point the economy in a particular direction. I'm glad this is a politically homeless. That's how I see myself. I was a member of the Labour Party for many years and left, must have been about 9 or 10 years ago now, and not party politically aligned. But I'm quite happy to see, I think there's a role for government in the market and in industries. My view increasingly, I think, has been that it's not so much in terms of directing markets or thinking it's better than markets. We all know there's lots of market failures and things that go wrong, but there's also lots of ways that governments go wrong as well. My view is sort of increasingly towards the stage that governments should be intervening to protect the vulnerable. And that applies in all sorts of areas, in social policy, in health policy, but also when it comes to the economy, when we know when people can be exploited by big companies and workers can be exploited. I think there's a big role for governments. When it comes to thinking it can do things better than markets, it has to be very careful. Not because markets get everything right, they don't, but the danger is you make things worse or can make things worse by getting involved. So I think that's where my scepticism comes from.
So Hilary and I, for regular listeners, will know that we're both in the SDP, and something that the SDP talks about is this idea of energy abundance, or having an energy policy that will result in much lower energy bills. not just because it will benefit consumers, household bills, but also because of it being such a high cost for businesses to operate, and one of the main drivers of businesses struggling. If you were to come in as a potential government and say, right, we're going to focus, like almost as a single issue, this is the thing we're going to focus on, just making sure that energy bills decrease so that businesses can benefit. Is that an industrial strategy?
Yeah, I think energy policy is part of an industrial strategy. So as I was saying before, that's an area where governments cannot fail but to be involved in some level in terms of the regulations they set, in terms of how they organise this sort of big natural monopoly in terms of certain aspects of energy. So yes, it's part of an industrial policy, which we will have in any case. And of course, it's whether you're going to have a good or bad approach to that, and I've got a lot of time for the SCP approach there. I'm just taking one quick step back. I think there are three big structural issues with the UK economy. We know we're sort of in this doom loop of not having enough money for government to spend, all this hugely pressing areas they want to spend money on, and low growth. We're not so bad as lots of countries actually, but historically very, very low growth. And then the response to that is we have lower tax takes, so they increase taxes, and then that sort of decreases growth again, and we get in this bit of a doom loop. I think there's three big things underpinning that. One is welfare and welfare spending, which it's been a lot of talk about. We know we spend more on welfare, depending on how you define it, than on the National Health Service, and it's only going to get higher. The second one is the COVID policy, which we're still feeling the effects of. The huge, hundreds of billions of pounds that was spent on paying people not to work and businesses to shut down. There's not much we can do about that now, but I think it's important. Hopefully we'll talk a bit later about the links between culture and economic policy, and indeed ethics and economic policy, which I think are important. And it's important we learn the lessons of what happened with the COVID policy. But the third one is energy, and that is where, as you say, we've got this really high energy prices. So it affects all sorts of things. So what we've got with the net zero policy and approach to that, we've got a high level of direct government spending, so many billions of pounds on all sorts of areas that are linked to energy. So, for example, subsidies on electric vehicles in the company car market, on heat pumps and so on. But more importantly, I think, are the policies which have directly driven energy high through the reliance on renewables, the phasing out of gas and oil, which have pushed energy prices high. What that does is it directly lowers growth, which not only affects the economy and our wealth, but also affects government tax spending, because we don't have the growth, which then reduces spending. And then, of course, you've got these sort of particular areas like the oil and gas sector, where our policy has been, well, let's import gas on ships from Qatar or America for purely ideological reasons, because we're shutting down or restricting North Sea oil and gas. And of course, then you very directly hit tax revenues. In fact, you make things worse, because you have all these tax credits when you're shutting down North Sea oil, and that hits government expenditure directly. So this idea of energy abundance, of course, the big thing is, can you come in and sort it out now? Clearly not, because where would you start with energy policy? It's not where we are now, because we've got this sort of huge investments in the renewable sector, which drive prices high directly because renewables are expensive. We can get into the details of that, but whether it's directly or in terms of the balancing costs and so on. But because you have to have the backup of gas and oil, but they're on standby, you're also increasing the price of those standby electricity sources. So it's sort of a lose-lose situation, but we've invested so much in those areas, it's really hard to come back. But of course, we have to do it to some extent, because if you talk to the energy experts, it's not just about the economic consequences, it's about energy supply and whether there's a danger of actually blackouts, and which, you talk to the energy experts who are independent, not working for NESO and so on, they are very, very concerned about that over the next few years, partly because policy is driving so much more electricity demand, through the electric vehicle mandate, heat pumps and so on. Everything's shifting to electricity, whereas the grid already is really struggling to cope. because of the fundamental problems of renewables. So it's a really big issue. And moving away from that, there are things we can do straight away, you know, pulling back on the electric vehicle mandate, cutting back on, you know, heat pumps, subsidies and so on, you know, letting the market decide on those areas, and the oil and gas situation. So there's things we can do straight away, but actually sorting out the long-term infrastructure is really hard to do, but it's got to be tackled and probably involves some expenditure in the short to medium term anyway. But that will, of course, create huge savings in the medium to long term.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you didn't mention there was also the effect of the industrial policy on jobs. So you remember I was up in Dundee at the Scottish TUC where Unite in particular running campaign to save the North Sea, because, you know, their members, I think quite rightly, say, you know, if I'm earning a good money on the oil rigs, I'm not going to give up that kind of a job just to take a very low paid job, effectively servicing the wind farms. So I think it's, you know, there's an issue for kind of job quality of jobs as well.
That's a really important issue. I mean, we have to be a little bit careful, because you can have you know, structural changes in the economy that have to happen, and that can cause, you know, pain for particular areas and particular sets of workers. And you have to be a little bit careful by saying we have to maintain jobs in a sector irrespective. You know, sometimes it's about managing the transition. But I think what's interesting with the jobs, you get this quote saying, well, we're investing in the you know, electric economy and renewable energies, and that's going to create 400,000 jobs. And again, that we've got to be very, very careful and say, okay, if you're creating a more expensive way of generating energy, so for example, you're generating energy in renewables, and that requires twice as many people as it did when you've got oil and gas in the North Sea, whether or not they're high or low wages. In principle, that's actually a less efficient way of doing things. That's not an economic benefit. Creating jobs, more people to do the same amount of work, is the opposite of what we want to do. We want to create jobs where people are being more productive. So just the fact that one area creates jobs, what you're saying was, well, okay, well, what could those people have been doing instead? Where are you taking those jobs from? And in practice, what's happening is that you know, that the energy sector doing things more efficiently and more costly, people are spending more money on that rather than in different areas of the economy, part of which might be high performing jobs in oil and gas, but it could be any area of the economy. You know, it could be the tech sector, it could be the service sector, it could be really fast, you know, areas where there's a productivity growth potential. So, you know, it's natural, isn't it? You think, oh, we're creating 20,000 jobs. That's a good thing. And, you know, it can be in a you know, time of when it's high unemployment and you've got a big factory coming in, great. But just in itself, doing the same thing or producing the same amount of things with more jobs shouldn't be seen as a sort of economic improvement.
That's a really good point. Yeah,
I think it's worth mentioning as well, because it might sound a bit I don't know, might sound a bit simplistic, but I think there's a real misunderstanding about the grid. And just for most people, and I think I'd be in this position if it wasn't for talking about it and looking into these things, is that if you're generating electricity through these renewables, it's not like you can just have it at any point. You know, we don't have much storage, battery power. And so you have to have, like you were saying, that standby, the oil and gas on standby. So you're paying for two things at once. And it's such an inefficient way of doing it. And there isn't a solution from the people that talk about net zero, for example. I think the official net zero policy is that we'll still have 15% fossil fuel or 15% of our electricity usage will be generated by fossil fuels by 2040 or whatever it is. I can't remember the date. And if we're still, even if the most sort of ardent net zero supporters are saying that we're going to be using fossil fuels in 10, 20 years' time, why would we be wanting to import those from other countries instead of using the resources we have available in the North Sea? No. It seems crazy to me. And
of all the policies, that's the most obvious one. You know, we say we're going to be using them anyway. I think it's a little bit, be careful about that. It's sort of 15%, but we need to think, okay, but the issue is that wind and solar has periods where it produces very little at all.
Yeah.
And so in those points, you potentially have to have gas and oil, we can talk about electricity as a separate issue, but gas and oil producing a large proportion, not just 15%, but for short periods of time. And as I said earlier, one of the issues with that is that you're then having to have a structure where you have to supply almost the whole of electricity at certain points from fossil fuels, but you're expecting all these facilities to be on standby. So the costs of doing that are really, really high, as opposed to having oil and gas sort of running fairly continuously. Now, oil and gas is quite good at sort of turning off and turning on and so on. And same with the old coal-fired power stations. One very near us in Nottingham, which got shut down a couple of years ago. It's interesting. Lots of countries are reopening coal-fired power stations because they can sometimes be the cheapest to build and easy to turn off and on, and coal is particularly cheap. I mean, if it's not impossible, we'll end up in that sort of situation where there's little alternative but to do that, which will be rather embarrassing for some of the current ministers. But going back to the point of different sources, the other area is nuclear power, which actually is very expensive. But what nuclear power can do, can give you a big baseline level of electricity where it's much harder to turn off and on, but it can be there in the background producing quite a bit. And of course, that's not fossil fuel, fine. But if you think of that, that's different to renewable energy. Renewable energy, the problem is they're unpredictable. You don't know when you're going to get lots of wind or lots of solar, and of course battery storage people talk about, but incredibly expensive, and the infrastructure required there, who knows what will happen in the future, but at the moment not really feasible. So you sort of then get to the question is, well, what's the point of the renewables at all? If you really want baseline that's non-fossil fuels, it's got to be nuclear. You can't turn that off and on. So it's not like you can add the renewables in when you want, because you can't necessarily mismatch. So for the adding off and on, it's probably gas or coal, or perhaps oil, or the rather strange situation we have in Yorkshire where they import wood pellets from a previously coal-fired power station. We have shiploads of wood pellets coming over from the US, and arguing this is sort of helping us be carbon neutral. I'm not sure how that works, but at least that sort of power can be switched on and off reasonably quickly. So then you think, well, actually, where is the role for renewables? And so all this investment we've got in this idea, well, we should go even further. The solution to worries about the grid is to have even more renewables. In a sense, could be throwing good money after bad, because you're never solving that fundamental problem. So we need. It's good to see Andy Burnham making one or two comments. Perhaps we're going to move back a little bit at the margin on some of these policies. That's not good enough, though. We need a really fundamental rethink on the production of energy and all this sort of associated policies.
Yeah, I think we agree there, and I think that's broadly in line with SDP policy, actually. So,
yeah, I think I was just thinking about the wood pellets thing. I think if I'm right on this, it's because they say that it's carbon neutral because the trees would have taken that amount of carbon out of the atmosphere. So by burning it, you're just putting it back into the atmosphere, which it seems a bit that seems a bit crazy to me that sort of gets a tick. But then something like the other ways of generating electricity doesn't. I liked this thing I heard recently, which was somebody I think at a meeting we were at said it's extracting oil from the North Sea doesn't produce carbon emissions. It's the burning it that produces it. And I thought it's a really good way of separating the two things, because you're saying, well, if we still, if we're bringing in importing fossil fuels from other countries, you say, well, if we're still using it, if we need it, then let's just burn our own. And that's the moment where it releases the carbon emissions. I think that's broadly a better way of thinking about it. I did see Novara Media were posting about Burnham deciding to open up the North Sea, and they were saying this is ludicrous that he's deciding to do this when we have the biggest drought that we've had for ever, whatever it was. And I thought, but that's the point, isn't it? If we're still using it, it's almost like they can't accept the fact that we're still using these things. So why not use our own? I feel in our bid to sort of rebuild the political, that's one of those things where it's like, are we imagining this? It's bizarre.
The arguments people sometimes make on that is that, well, if you take oil from the North Sea, we're not necessarily going to burn that directly in terms of our fuel. It may get exported onto national markets and may not lower oil prices. I don't think that's quite so true of gas, because I think gas would come directly from the North Sea. But with oil, there's some truth to that. But of course, even if it goes into national markets, what you're doing, the government is then able to get taxes from that infrastructure. So, there really is no, or seems to be very, very weak arguments against using what we can in the North Sea, and at least letting companies decide. Are we near the end of North Sea production? Well, I think there's still quite a lot there. Maybe not at the peak level, but we don't really know what's left to be explored. And with the signals and the way the tax is structured at the moment, we're seeing BP pulling out of North Sea oil, other companies doing the same. And the danger is that the whole industry out there becomes unsustainable if the really big players move out. So again, we need a big shift there, and it's really hard to see a logical argument against it.
Shall we move on in terms of your 3 points, David? Because I don't want us to just talk about energy, even though it is very interesting. So your other 2 points were COVID hangover and welfare spending.
Yeah.
We can move on to those, but perhaps just pause just slightly before we do, because I think on the industrial side, perhaps the other thing, you've said there that you think there is a role for effectively government to be involved in energy. Are there other areas where it's important that government takes a lead in terms of making sure that the building blocks are there for industry to thrive? So I know one of the things, for example, is in our policy is around skills and training. Would you agree that that's part of an industrial strategy? Is there anything else that we need to think about?
Part of government, help for the economy, skills and training, looking at universities, R&D. And I think there's a good case for subsidies, government spending in those areas to kickstart areas where the market is unlikely to, or is taking too higher risk. It's transport infrastructure, but we need to be careful. It doesn't necessarily have to be the government directing everything or owning everything. And I think there's probably a little bit too much focus on the specific ownership of some of these things. I'm not particularly dogmatic about ownership. You can pick out examples around the world of even water or a rail industry, for example, which are government owned or not, and make a case. I don't think ownership ends up being absolutely critical there. You have government failure as much as market failure. So yeah, there's a role for government to have an overview for making sure the conditions are right for industry, but that doesn't necessarily mean government's directing or deciding very directly what areas they want to be spending money on training, for example, but helping the market deliver that, and helping universities to deliver what people want and what companies want. Yeah, of course, there's a role for government.
And one of the ways that this government, if we count this government the same one as the Starmer government, has been kind of pursuing that, is the British Business Bank, BBB. Have you any views on that?
Yeah, I don't particularly have that strong views on it. I mean, it seems a bit nebulous what they mean by that. They're sort of taking various bits of funding from different places and giving it a label. It seems to be that's more spin rather than substance at the moment. Andy Burnham's talked a lot about regional policy and devolution and so on. Not entirely sure devolution's been a huge success when you look at what's happened to the NHS in Wales and so on. But I think generally the idea of subsidiarity, thinking where you can make decisions, best place for local level as a sort of principle, I've got a lot of sympathy for. I think the practicalities of that are rather different. So, for example, I don't see the number 10 in the north as being devolution. Actually, we elect, every area elects their MPs to go to Parliament, and giving MPs power, is in itself a sort of devolution policy. The idea you just situate some parts of government. It's not saying it's a bad thing, but you've got to look at all these things, look at the costs of it, and are you spending money in the right way and using resources in the right way? Otherwise, the danger is you get into a Strasbourg, Brussels situation where you spend millions moving hundreds of MPs across countries, and you ask the question, well, is this really just for show? So I sort of lost track of it from where we go. British Bank. At the moment, that's spin. When we see some substance in that and what they mean, well, let's see. But the big issue is the government doesn't have money to spend. So there's much bigger issues about what we do about that. And tax. So it's either taxation, borrowing, or spending. One of those three areas are the things which all recent governments have been trying to tackle. We know there's no easy wins on those. There were easy losses, as happened in COVID. But there are no easy wins, apart from perhaps the net zero, the energy policy. So at the moment, things are being presented to us as there is no choice but to do this because of the climate crisis. And now there's a little bit more debate going on about whether it is such an existential crisis. Do we have more ability to actually decide, look at costs and benefits? I think that's for me, just again, taking a bit of a step back. Two things I think that government policy has really missed out on. One is the ethical basis, which is odd for an economist. I'm an economist. We know nothing about ethics and morals and love, and this is all about money in principle. But actually, I think economists are quite good at separating things out. We can separate out what we call positive economics. What will happen if you do this? What are the consequences? And here are some choices, as opposed to what you should do. And then we all have our own value judgments about, given these choices you've got, what is the best thing to do? And actually, economists are quite well placed at separating those out. And I think actually policy should be underpinned by ethics and what's right and wrong. So, for example, if we look at the COVID policy with really big economic consequences about lockdowns and so on, actually the starting point should have been well-established public health ethics about when governments have the right to introduce mandatory measures like ordering businesses to shut down, or ordering people not to work, or telling you whether you can invite your mum into your home for a cup of tea. And actually, had we followed those ethical principles first, we would have been in a different situation. And I think governments and policymakers have a tendency to go, the end justifies the means. So, for example, in there, they were convinced, as we know probably wrongly, that COVID lockdowns would reduce COVID spread and save lives and so on, and the same with the sort of vaccine mandates. We know that those claims are oversold, but they believed those, and they said, okay, to achieve this outcome, then any means is okay. That's the important thing, we achieve the outcome. And I think that's the wrong way of looking at it, which might sound odd as an economist. Your starting point should be, okay, what are the right limits of our policy? What are the rights and wrongs of it? And then within those, okay, what are the costs and benefits of different choices? And actually, that's a second element where I think in all sorts of areas, net zero being one, Brexit being another, COVID policy being a third, and actually there's other areas you could talk about as well, where we haven't had a sensible debate about costs and benefits of really important economic policies. And Rishi Sunak admitted that in these post-COVID discussions when he said, well, they're actually discouraged from having a discussion about the costs of lockdowns. And it's sort of crazy. But what I think has happened is that there's been an approach where one side of the argument the other side will say, well, if you believe this, if you believe you don't believe lockdowns are right, you're a granny killer. If you don't believe in net zero policy, you're a denier, trying to associate people with, Nazi denialism. If you're in favour of Brexit, you're a racist. So the idea is that you don't have a substantive debate on policy or economics. You sort of have a debate on people, and you try and say, well, one side of the debate is not worth discussing with. And we've seen this time and time again. And actually, that's I think it's resulted in really bad economic policy. Brexit being one example. That wasn't one of my three huge, challenges for the economy, because I think it's actually not, so substantive. We could have stayed in the EU or left in the EU, and there are costs and benefits. We could have had a much more sensible argument about that if the debate had been toned down a little bit, and we hadn't othered one side of the debate.
And that's kind of what we're trying to do in terms of rebuilding a political debate, try to stop that kind of polarisation and moralisation of discussion rather than having a debate on a political level. It's important to refine that political space for discussion and debate.
And COVID,
I think it's got a little bit better on energy policies we've been talking about. There's a bit more debate now. I think the SDP has played a role in that. So has the growth of other smaller parties and dissenters.
Yeah,
but it's still a hard road to furrow, particularly in academia, to be a dissenter from sort of mainstream approaches. You have to have, I think, quite a bit of determination, I think, to put your arguments forward.
I'm sure. Yeah,
I think COVID is probably the best, or the hardest test for that question of moralising politics, because, and I think that it was probably the real, politics changed in 2015, 2016, but I think COVID was the thing that really it sort of set off an explosion where everything in the political sphere became moralized. And, you were talking about ethics and such, and then you started talking about the idea of having a cost-benefit analysis of COVID policy. And I'm thinking the people at the time, and I remember this at the time, that whenever you suggested that maybe government policy wasn't the right way of going about it, people would immediately say, but, this is more important than the economy. This is people's lives. And is there a chance that, I suppose, how do you push back on that? And also just briefly, the COVID, the sort of COVID era is something that I feel like as a country, we have decided to push behind us. And even those of us that were, outraged by the decisions that the government made at that time, we've sort of accepted that it's such a sensitive subject. I don't want to sort of unearth that again. What use is there in going back over it and looking at where we maybe went wrong and how we would respond in the future?
Well, the obvious answer is to not make similar mistakes in the future, and looking at the principles. And the point about deaths being more important than the economy is an important one, because at heart there's an element of truth in that. As I said, the first point should be the ethical side of things. So for example, if a government was to deliberately kill somebody or injure an innocent person, that would be wrong, however good the outcomes were. So if that was we could perhaps agree on that. But actually, the right way is to tackle that argument in terms of COVID, because when you look at any policy, it's not just a question of saving lives. Any interventional policy has an impact on people's lives, and we're actually fairly used to doing that. So, for example, a level of pollution. We know that pollution has an impact on people's health, and some people do die from pollution. We don't, as a result, say, well, our aim is to have absolutely zero pollution and nobody dying at all. Same with road accidents. We could ban cars, and we could say you can never drive your child to school, and as a result, we would reduce the number of deaths on the road.
Careful, David. They're going to get ideas if you start saying this.
Well, that's true. But you get as a principle. We actually say, okay, let's look at this. Of course, to deliberately kill an innocent person would be wrong, but a policy that results in certain people dying is not in itself wrong, because anything you do does that. If we had no pollution and we shut down all factories, we would be producing no plastics, no energy, and so on. Many people would die from poorer healthcare that we'd have, from lack of drugs that we would have in pharmaceuticals, from all sorts of areas, from poverty, because we could impoverish the country. People would be living in a really poor existence, and many people would die of starvation and so on. So of course we say, okay, well, we've got to take a rounded view. We're not saying that the economy is more important than lives. We're saying when we look at this policy, they will have certain outcomes which we are more or less sure about, and we will do our best to evaluate them within the context of there are some things that we should not do as a government. And actually, when it comes to COVID, there were fairly well established public health principles, which not everyone would agree with, but reasonably good, that when you're looking at a mandatory intervention, shutting people, lockdowns and so on, you've got to fulfill a certain number of conditions. You've got to be really sure that the benefits are going to be higher than the costs. You've got to be fairly sure that there are going to be big benefits. You've got to be sure that there's no real alternative way of doing it, for example, relying on voluntary measures and so on. And we clearly didn't apply those principles to that case. But then once you do, you've still got this case of looking at taking an overall view of costs and benefits. And this is where we have a really general lesson that had we been willing to do that, there were lots of economics. We're quite good at cost-benefit analysis, and it's not an easy area. There's lots of different ways of doing it. There were quite a number of cost-benefit analysis of lockdowns, which took different approaches, but almost without exception, concluded that even if lockdowns were going to have really high benefits, the costs they were going to have in terms of the poverty, in terms of the loss of education, in terms of loneliness, and however you measure not just economic but social costs, were going to dwarf any potential benefits, even if those benefits were high. As we know, actually there probably weren't many benefits from lockdowns. So that work was being done, but it was ignored by government. And that's where we can have a lesson and say, well, actually, all policy choices, there are pros and benefits and costs. I mean, you need to look at them carefully, and that's the same with net zero. You have to take a step back and, from the sort of highly politicised thing of it's a climate crisis and you have no choice but to do this. That's designed to shut down debate. And the same with Brexit, where people are saying, well, Brexit's been an economic disaster. We have no choice but to get back to the EU. Well, I'm an economist, and I was in favour of Brexit, but actually it wasn't really because of the economic arguments. There were arguments on both sides. And of course, there are some costs, there are some benefits. And that's true from what's happened since Brexit. And there are costs and benefits, and it's worthwhile being honest about those and going through them carefully, and then saying, well, okay, if we do decide to have the EU reset, and what are going to be the costs and benefits of those? It's not all one way, and I think that's where the lessons of COVID, net zero, we can make sure applied everywhere, just to allow debate and actually. What we shouldn't be getting away from is a free speech issue, because underlying a lot of this has been the deliberate attempt to shut down dissenting voices in all sorts of areas. And we know it extends to social policy on transgender. I've been involved in the pro-life movement for a long time, and we've experienced that for 40, 50 years. But it actually has economic consequences. When you shut down debate, you have much worse debate and you end up with much worse policy. So even if you're on the other side on the COVID debate and you felt lockdowns were perhaps worthwhile, the policies would have been, I think, improved by a more vigorous debate. The idea that we should have a consensus. So it's my teeth go on edge when I hear Andy Burnham saying, well, we should look for a consensus in dealing with care policy. And of course, that's a really big area, and it really needs looking at. But I'm not sure that's the right way of doing things, because there's lots of different approaches to that. There's implications for spending, and do we treat it as an insurance? Do we focus on a particular group? And let's thrash it out. Let's have a really vigorous argument, and not necessarily tone down. I think we should tone down the personal element where you try and shut one side up. But I'm not convinced we should tone down the level of political debate. I don't mind quite angry and impassioned political debate, as long as you can go over the top, as long as you try and base it in evidence and arguments. We should be encouraging that. So the idea that insurgent parties like the SDP or Reform or Restore or whatever it is are a sort of danger to democracy. Actually, no. The danger to democracy is this cosy consensus where you have every MP bar perhaps two voting in favour of the Climate Change Act, or voting in favour of lockdown policy, or the vast majority of MPs who didn't want us to have originally to have a referendum on Brexit, or really to implement it properly. No, let's have a really vigorous debate, including economists and all sorts of other groups of people who might have a contribution.
Yeah, here. I just want to get us back on track in terms of your three items. So I'm just conscious that, perhaps it wasn't on my bingo card of things you might say for you to say that the COVID overhang is one of the big challenges. So are you thinking about that in terms of the debt on the books, as it were, from the COVID spending, or are you thinking more of the kind of quantitative tightening that the Bank of England's still doing and kind of creating?
It's a bit of both, but the most obvious point is the debt. So we spent, £400 or £500 billion on COVID measures. Some of those you could argue, well, it's dealing with the virus itself. But if you just sort of separate out paying people not to work and paying companies to shut down, so that those two very direct things, perhaps £170 billion was spent. So that's a whole year's worth of NHS. Now, within a context of COVID, so that's one aspect. But the other aspect was by ordering companies not to operate and people not to work, you also drastically slowed down economic growth. So that in itself had an impact on government tax take and people's wealth. So, that the overhang comes in both those areas. And we saw actually, even after that, as we came out of COVID, it's hard to separate some of these things, but you had the energy crisis. Now, partly that was the Ukraine-Russia war, but that wasn't the only thing. As you came out of COVID, you had this mass demand for energy, and you had these bottlenecks because supply chains were reopening up, and that also contributed to a big increase in energy costs, which sort of started before the Russia-Ukraine war. So actually part of the huge amount of money the government spent in lowering energy costs was linked to that as well. So all those areas, COVID has an impact, and we're still dealing with that consequence. So at a time when we were still had the overhang from the 2010 crisis, we had, I think it's self-induced, but it's still there, the net zero policy crisis and the Russia-Ukraine war. The COVID policy was not just a straw on the camel's back, it was sort of several bales of hay on the camel's back that really made things worse. So had that not happened, we would be in quite a different situation. Now, I know on one point we can't change what's happened then, but I do think it's important to at least look at how we got there and how policy was made to look at how things can be improved in the future.
I think there is also the issue of people got so used to working from home that it's very difficult to get people back into offices. And I still think people are more productive when they're working collectively.
So, you have a big change. It's not all bad. You see times in meetings, there's some efficiency savings that were probably accelerated by that COVID change and the move to IT, and people are now gradually working out what works best. And of course, now we've got the AI revolution as well, which is also people will take time to settle down. So it's not necessarily the case that everything that happened during that process had net economic negative consequences. But when we look at policy, I think we identify a really big issue which we're still dealing with.
I was just thinking when you said they paid people not to work, I was thinking that's a hell of a policy, isn't it? Like, probably one of the least efficient policies you could think of. Should we move on to welfare, because it's your third pillar?
Yeah.
So
yeah, sure. So I mean, the reason I mention it as the big structural problem is just because of the amount of money that's involved. So again, it depends how you include pensions and so on, but £300 to £400 billion a year being spent on welfare, and that we've had lots of strands of this, a big increase in NEETs, in the young people not working, in people on sick pay. Some of it linked to migration, which I haven't included as one of those three big issues, not because migration isn't a huge issue, of course it is culturally and socially, but economically it's probably harder to, there are more pros and cons of growing population and so on. So I don't want to sort of minimise that as an issue that needs to be tackled, but as a sort of really structural issue within the UK economy, I think welfare is probably much bigger. That's of course, successive governments have really tried hard to tackle this, and it's impossible. And for me as an economist, you can say, well, yeah, there's a couple of obvious things you can do. You could, the triple lock for pensions doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. Would a double lock or a single lock would release quite a lot of money in terms of OBR projections, and just seems to me very obvious. But then politically, that seems completely toxic, and people have sort of hinted at that and not gone anywhere. I do wonder if one party was to sort of grasp the metal and really push it, but then they're worried about electoral consequences. I'm not a political scientist, so maybe they're right. But for me as an economist, that seems a very simple.
It's all about
a double lock instead of a triple lock. You release quite a lot of money.
I mean, we would say we probably could go to, I think, I don't want to speak for Hilary, you could probably go back to a link of between pensions and average earnings. And I think it's all about branding, David. If you say single lock, that doesn't sound great. So you've got to say gold-plated lock, something like that. And I think that's how you get the public on board.
Okay.
Outdo the branding of the triple lock.
Yeah, the intergenerational.
Average earnings is probably the right way to do it as well. You look at the OBR projections; it'll make quite a bit of difference.
Yeah, I've argued strongly for replacing the triple lock with a link to earnings, because I do think that rebinds the generations together. The interests of the working and the retired populations rebinds those interests back together.
And it's easy for us to understand as well.
Yeah, protect. Pensions had fallen behind a long way with this. Average earnings had increased, but it's just sort of the pendulum swung too far in the other direction, I think. And again, it's choices. Yes, it would be lovely to maintain that triple lock, but actually, what are the consequences of doing it? There are things you are not spending money on, whether your priority is defence or measures to tackle working poverty or education or health service, whatever it is, or just tax, getting the private economy going by reducing taxes, whatever you think is a priority, they are choices. So it's not just a question of, should we be doing this? It's, if we do this, what are we not doing that we might have done instead?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's quite interesting. Have you read some of the stuff that Andy Burnham's new administration has put out on the LBR, and asking the LBR to cost not just the cost of making a positive change, but to cost the effect of no change when they're doing forecasts?
I know I've not seen that, but I mean, yes, that'd be a good thing. But there've been lots of discussions about the OBR and how well they forecast things, and it's very hard. For example, if you cut taxes in a particular area or increase them, it's really hard for economists to project forward the behavioural aspects of that. And the OBR, may make an effort at that, but how will you introduce a wealth tax? How will people respond? What will be the tax take? And there's quite a few examples of corporation tax and capital gains tax where you get the sort of Laffer curve effect and you don't get as much money as you would expect. Potentially the other way. This was the argument of Liz Truss, wasn't it? That to have a big it was really weird how it was positioned, because it seemed to me really quite a left-wing approach that we're going to release a lot of spending in a way through tax cuts, but have a sort of Keynesian injection to the economy. But in one sense of trying to break that doom loop of tax increases, low growth, and you have more tax increases because government tax goes down. As to try and break that loop, I think is would be a good thing. We are restricted by where we start with because the debt is so high, and it's fine saying we shouldn't be in hock to the international markets, but that's fine. If you're in debt and you own money, you can't just ignore that completely. It's not enough to blame it on the markets on its own. So you've got to, I think, at some point look at some of these big areas of expenditure.
I can feel you tutting now, Sebastian, because you hate it when we use economistic terms and don't explain them. So OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, that's a kind of department of government that checks the Chancellor's numbers. And the Laffer curve, do you want to just explain the Laffer curve
of course.
briefly?
So the Laffer curve is the idea that if you have a tax rate, let's say you tax corporation tax, you tax profits at 10%, and people say, companies, they're earning loads of money, let's tax them at 15% and we'll double our tax take. And of course, that isn't necessarily the case, because if you increase the profits, companies may then respond. So some international companies may take their operations and go over to Ireland, where their corporation tax may be lower than 10%, or they may find ways, employer pay lots of money to pay a fancy accountant to make it look like they're not making so many profits, and so on. And the Laffer curve says, well, as you increase the tax rate, you probably will increase the tax take, but not by quite as much as you think. But there will come a point at which you're actually taking less tax by increasing the tax rate. So that's easy to see. If you increase the income tax, say from 90% to 100%, you can think, well, who's going to bother earning at all? You're probably people will work on the black market, and you'll actually lose money. So it's that sort of idea. And there's plenty of examples where the Laffer curve point is, where that point of maximum revenue is another matter. But there's some evidence that some of the tax increases in Scotland, for example, where they had some discretion, may have led to actually a lower amount of tax being brought in. So then you get into an issue of, we want the richer to pay more in tax, of course, but if you increase a tax on the rich and you end up getting less tax, did you still want to do it? And then you get into the elements of ideology. And I think most people would say, well, okay, however much we want to tax the rich more than the poor, if increasing a particular tax rate will end up with less money, we probably really don't want to do that. So you have got to be a bit careful about just increasing tax rates.
I do think sometimes it's used a little bit simplistically by people on the economic right, where they say, you can't increase taxation, just look at the Laffer curve, there you go, that's your answer there. And I think I heard someone say once, the Laffer curve tells you that the optimal amount of taxation is somewhere between 0% and 100%.
I think that's true, but we can do a bit better than that. There are plenty of examples across the world where we can look at particular taxes and say, well, how successful were they increasing? And different environments you have to take account of. But that's one of the things economists can have, make a contribution in terms of policy evaluations and trying to get cause and effect. And it's not an easy thing to do, but you can get evidence on those sort of things. So yes, you're right. It's easy for anyone to say as soon as you increase any tax rate, you're gonna make less money. I think you look at the level of public expenditure and taxation at the moment in the UK. It's at a reasonably high level historically, not necessarily the highest level looking across all countries across the world, but you're probably at the area where you are in danger of not getting as much money as you would like from tax increases, because of course the Laffer curve isn't just that you'll get less money; it's the proportion you will get. Will you, get proportionally as much as you're increasing the tax rate? And it's not just the tax rate, of course, because of course taxes may then affect growth and economic well-being, which may have longer term effects on there. So yeah, you're right; it can be used by both sides, but you can't ignore it.
I thought perhaps we can move on to this that you mentioned earlier. You wanted to talk about the point at which culture and the economy meet.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched on some of those things already. So I think the idea of ethics playing a role in policy, I think, is one of those points which is really important. But the big issue is the free speech debate, where we've got all these examples which I think have directly affected economic policy as well as all sorts of other policies. So I think we sometimes think, well, these are separate issues, culture and the economy, but they're not entirely. Economic decisions come out of a political environment, and that political environment is shaped by the way in which debate has happened and is allowed to happen. So a culture within which debate has been, stymied on really, really big issues, from which we can, we can include immigration, but welfare, Brexit, COVID, and all sorts of cultural, social issues as well, has really, I think, lowered the quality of debate and lowered the quality of policy outcomes as well. So I think that's where the sort of interface is. We see it as well in, perhaps the role of academia as well, because academia's, we've seen it just the last few weeks, haven't we, with the discussion about Jason Arday and the role of DEI and how that shapes academia. I think that's not irrelevant to the debate. We're probably a little bit less affected by those sort of issues in the economics world, but not entirely. We operate within a highly sensitive political environment in universities, where we see so many examples of academics who have been punished either directly or indirectly for speaking out of turn, if you like, or talking about issues which are not seen as within the mainstream. And of course, if anyway, academia is where we should be having this sort of more perhaps extreme's the wrong word, but we should be having debates where you do talk about things which policymakers may not touch. So it may be politically sensitive to talk about the triple lock, but in academia we should be discussing all those issues and looking at the consequences. And I think my experience is quite interesting, because I've done lots of research into all sorts of areas. Economists, we're very imperialistic. We talk about, we have economics work looking at abortion laws, I've done work on sex education, not necessarily on the economic consequences, but looking at how people make decisions and framing it with an economic framework, and looking at, if you have this policy, what will be the outcome. And for me, that's fantastic. COVID policy being another one. You can look at all these areas. So I've ended up doing research on sex education, on assisted suicide, economics of assisted suicide, on Brexit, on COVID policy, on vaccine mandates. So I've sort of touched on all these areas which potentially are quite toxic, and in all those areas, academics have to some extent suffered. Can you guess which area has been the most toxic for me personally? I've had the most pushback.
Brexit, reset, EU.
Yeah, you're right. It's Brexit, actually. So I've survived in academia in all these areas, and I have had points where I've been told people are talking about you behind your back, but I've never been directly told you shouldn't be researching this. The only type problem I've had was when I was writing about Brexit soon after the referendum, and I had the Dean of Faculty ring me up and saying the Deputy Vice Chancellor's asked me to call you because of your writings on Brexit. And there were various issues. Of course, it was all framed in, it's not about your views, we welcome your views, it's how you express them and expressing them robustly. And is this what an academic should be doing? So, yes, an academic should be expressing reviews robustly based on evidence. And it was very, it's really interesting because of all the areas, this was one where you would think economists in particular should be having a really good debate on both sides. And, I think there were good arguments on both sides and should be thrashing it out. But one of the quotes that will stay with me was, there's a feeling that you have too positive a view about the post-Brexit economy. I thought, wow. So expressing that makes you, it's something where the Deputy Vice-Chancellor has asked somebody to call me up. Now, I was a professor at the time, so I wasn't looking for promotion. And actually, what they wanted was me to stop using the university's name at the bottom of my writings. And I said, well, that doesn't mean the university agrees with me. That's just saying where I work. And you see this in all sorts of things. You can have people on direct opposite sides of the debate, Palestine and Israel, whatever it might be, from the same university. And of course, you say where you're from. So I said, no, I won't do that. And I had some quite good support from the union, and they did back down. But what was really interesting was, had I been a more junior member of staff, had I been looking for promotion, what would my reaction have been? I think just it's human nature, isn't it? You respond to this. So people often talk about the process. We've got a very good, I think, generally free speech policy at the University of Nottingham, which has been strengthened recently, and the Higher Education Free Speech Act is quite positive in that point of view. But there have been lots of examples at the university where individuals have been put through horrible processes, sometimes with the right outcome, but still that process is a punishment. So I feel quite fortunate. I know people who have been cancelled and have lost their jobs because of things they said about COVID, perfectly sensible things, or about Brexit, or about transgender issues. And I'm who knows what will happen tomorrow, after this podcast or when this podcast is published. But at the moment, I'm still in a job, and I think the university is, as I said, I feel I've been able to do research and haven't been told not to do things. But underlying this is a sort of culture of fear, I think, to some extent in many universities, and it's not a good situation to be in. I think there have been some areas of improvement with the recent legal changes, but it's something that doesn't, because universities are a source of ideas, of research analysis, of policy analysis. So I think we shouldn't underestimate the importance of ensuring free and open debate in higher education.
That's great, and I've been really enjoying some of your writing and your comments on X about the reset, because certainly that's another area where it feels that there's a bit of a jeopardy in criticising the way that the reset is going forward. It does, not to reintroduce the culture wars into this at all, but it does feel to me that reset is more like rejoin by any other name. I'm very worried about reset.
Right. I think that there are a certain number of politicians who are ideologically wedded to the idea that we should be anything being closer to the EU is good, anything Brexit is bad. And actually, surely the right way of thinking about this is conditional on us not being in the EU. The right policy decisions are different to being in there. So if you're not in the EU, you've got to think, well, what's the best way we can do things? There are some costs. Trade is a little bit more costly. Goods trade with EU countries, even though we've got a free trade deal, there are certainly some costs there. But there are also opportunities in terms of service trade, where we've got particular strengths, and with non-EU trade deals, with regulatory areas where we can diverge. And the danger is with the reset, you have all of the sort of bad aspects of the EU, where we're tied to rules without having a democratic say, but you lose the opportunity to have the good aspects of Brexit, where you can diverge where it suits you and suits your economy. You can have better relationships with non-EU countries and still have a good trade with EU countries. And I think that's the danger of the reset. And I think for me, the red line is, if you have any part of the reset where you are saying we will follow an EU law, which we don't know what it will be in the future, and we will commit to doing that rather than our MPs deciding, that's when you get something where you are overstepping the grey area, and you're almost certainly not going to end up in a good economic situation as a result.
Sounds great. Yeah, good. I agree with that, definitely. I just want, before we move on, perhaps to Culture Club, I just wanted to, just while we've got you here, I think we've talked quite a lot about, the things that the kind of pillars that you set out at the beginning, particularly energy. But we've talked over a number of podcasts about some of the British businesses that are really struggling. So Denby that went under, we talked about British Steel. And I'm guessing because you have a kind of insight into what are the things that are concerning and worrying businesses, is there anything that we're not talking about that perhaps is an issue for British businesses that politicians should be thinking about?
Of course, there are lots of things, but I'm afraid you cannot get away from energy. So the examples of British Steel and Denby, it's energy. In the pottery industries, it's energy. That is, that we shouldn't minimise that by talking about other things, but of course there are. Okay. So there's a debate about, the regulatory environment. So there's a balance, between protecting workers from exploitation and overstepping the bounds in terms of the costs of regulation, but also regulating smartly. I'm very much in favour of a minimum wage. I think that's a very positive aspect, but I think we're probably at a level now where the question is there a point at which the minimum wage is threatening jobs, particularly amongst young people? I don't have a particular problem with having a lower minimum wage for younger age workers. I can see why people want to, support low incomes and get people into jobs, but there is a trade-off between encouraging people into work but also not having so many jobs available, and people at a younger age, on average, are likely to be a little bit less productive. So giving companies a bit more flexibility there. So I think there are those areas where you can be, you may be, have you gone too far? But you can't get away from energy as being that big driver for those manufacturing industry.
I've just realised that that's the first time I've ever put my hand up on the podcast. It's because you're a professor. I feel like I'm in a class. I put my hand up.
I wish my students did that.
I was just going to ask about the minimum wage because it's a conversation that doesn't really get had. I feel that nobody really discusses it. What should the minimum wage be? So
the idea of the minimum wage for me is that it stops workers being exploited by large companies. Well, two areas: rogue companies who may be quite small, and people who don't know what their income should be, and they take on a job because they're desperate. And actually, this rogue company, they don't necessarily have the information, so that can give them some protection because it's easy to see what the minimum wage should be, and a company knows they're breaking the law. But the other area is to protect against big companies who have what we call monopsony power. So they have power in the labour market to drive wages down. And if you look at sort of simple economic models, it's quite possible that you take a big company like McDonald's and that you could have a minimum wage above the sort of market level, and actually you can end up with more people being employed because the market level, it's if you increase the wage for one of your workers, you've got to increase it for everyone. So the marginal cost of doing that is actually quite high. So you keep wages low relative to how much benefit they would give you. But if you force a wage up above that sort of monopoly level, you get closer to what the sort of free market equilibrium would be if you didn't have monopoly power. And actually, it's possible that wages can go up, but also unemployment can go down. Of course, there's a limit to that. At some point, if you increase the minimum wage up to £20 an hour or £30 an hour, of course you would lose jobs. So the difficult thing for policymakers is what is the level at which that trade-off is about right? And you can't give an absolute answer to that because it's not one labour market we operate in. We have different labour markets across the country. In London, it's very different to the North West or the Midlands where I am, and also in different industries. So you have to be a little bit careful. If you're having a national minimum wage, it's really easy. People know what it is. I think it's a good idea, but you probably have to be a little bit cautious and say, well, what are we trying to do with this? We're trying to cut out the worst of the exploitation of vulnerable workers without losing jobs. Probably no level where you can lose no jobs, and there's no level where you can say, well, we solving that whole issue of vulnerable workers. But you have to pick a policy level, and that's beyond the level of economists. We as economists can say, well, looking across countries, these are sort of levels where you go above this area, it looks like you're losing more jobs than you. And you may want to worry about the benefits. Of course, you're putting more money into people's pockets by increasing the minimum wage. So some of the worst concerns about the increase in the living wage in the last budget perhaps haven't come through because you're increasing spending amongst people who are on quite low incomes anyway, and that can help the economy. So that can help the pubs have been hit by a minimum wage. They've also benefited to some extent by people having more money to spend. But I think they're probably, we're probably at that level where you look compared to 10, 20 years ago, it's gone up quite significantly. And, would probably, you've got to be careful before you go any further. So you can't give an absolute answer to what should it be, but you can set out the consequences in terms of jobs and poverty and so on.
Great. Shall we move on to Culture Club? And for once, Sebastian, I think you have something to bring to Culture Club, don't you?
I do. And let's start with me. So I can't remember who it was we were talking to. I think it was Luke Gittos who's mentioned the Odyssey and some of the controversy around the casting of it. I think if anybody's listening to this and hasn't heard of the Odyssey, either the original Homer poem or the new Chris Nolan film, then I'm impressed. But you must be living under a rock because it is everywhere at the moment. I went to see it last week, and it is epic. Is probably the only word for it. It is really quite impressive. The things they managed to film. I heard somebody say in a review that it's the sort of thing that if aliens came down to planet Earth and said, "What is cinema?" you'd just put that on and say, "This is cinema." Have you seen it, David?
Yes, I saw it last week as well, and you're absolutely right. It's epic. I enjoyed it. I did have some sort of qualifications. It was too long. All films are too long for me. Maybe that's my age. I don't know. And I get a bit fed up sometimes with this sort of. They put in this how he's agonising about all the people he's killed in the Trojan Wars on his way back, which I thought was a bit unnecessary, but it was epic, and I did enjoy it overall. It was a really good spectacle, and the casting didn't particularly bother me at all. I generally have that view that actors are actors, so if they're good actors, then don't really mind who's playing them within some sort of limits. Yeah, I enjoyed it.
Great, yeah. And for anybody that's listening to this and wants no spoilers, perhaps turn off, because I think there's no way of talking about the film without talking about some spoilers. For anybody that doesn't know the story, it's the story of Odysseus, who is a key character in the Trojan War, which is mythological, but the current sort of consensus is that there was the city of Troy and there was something like a Trojan War. It probably didn't have Athena and Zeus on the battlefield, but it would have happened around 1200 BC. And there was this story of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they were passed down, generation after generation. And Homer then put it down on paper in 800 BC. And so it's one of the foundational texts, certainly of Western literature. And whilst you're watching the film, some things you'll think, that seems a little bit cheesy. And then you realise, yeah, but that's cheesy because it's been copied hundreds and thousands of times since it was made. And I think the story itself, it's about Odysseus' journey home and him trying to return home after the Trojan War, and everything kind of goes wrong and it's difficult for him to get back. I know you've spoken about it on the podcast because you used to read it to your boys, didn't you?
I did, yeah.
And I think it's really apt for Take Me Home podcast because it is about homecoming. And there are things about the Odyssey, the Chris Nolan version, that people will dislike. And you alluded to one of them, which is this sort of modern take, this sort of guilt-ridden take on his character that I thought were exceptional. And I think that if Nolan had tried to do a version of the Odyssey which was faithful to the original, I think it would have been rubbish. And we'd have all said, oh no, this is just, it's somehow wrong, it doesn't work. Because it's the sort of story you can't really put into a film and perfectly display it. I mean, there's so much that was missed out in this version, but he had to make those choices. I mean, it was 2 hours and 50 minutes, so I'm glad he cut out some of the bits of the original story. But what I loved about it is that he's telling a story and he's using that as the inspiration for this modern retelling. And I mean, as a Christian, perhaps I have a slight bias in the way that I might interpret it. But I loved some of the themes about guilt and about atonement. And the key element, I suppose, to this version is this idea that he realizes at one point that he actually doesn't want to go home, and it's him coming to terms with that. And I felt it was a film really about post-traumatic stress disorder, which is wild. I had not gone into the cinema expecting that, and I thought it was wonderful, absolutely wonderful. And I'm going to talk about this in this speech I'm giving on Saturday. I'm going to use elements of it to maybe give us some inspiration of how we can rebuild Britain. But I really think it's about a sort of a dying civilization in a way. You know, they talk about the sea people in the film. I won't give that a spoiler. And I think there are parallels to how we can see our current society and our civilization and how we can learn from that. So I thought it was wonderful.
And when you just referred there to a speech on Saturday, so you're speaking in Nottingham on
Nottingham,
Saturday.
yeah. So if there's any Take Me Home listeners around the Nottingham or East Midlands area, please do come along. I can't remember where it is. It's the Free Thinkers. So if you type in Free Thinkers Nottingham, you'll find the event on meetup.com.
And we'll put a link in the show notes anyway.
We will, yeah.
Of course, yeah.
They're a good group of people. It'll be an interesting debate. So I echo the invitation for people to go along.
I mean, I really enjoyed the film. As you know, I had some kind of reservations about the fact that it isn't true to the original, and because we're kind of steeped in the original, I think that kind of jarred with me a little bit. I mean, some of the things that I think, you know, so in the original, a really key concept is that Odysseus is wily. It's always wily Odysseus or cunning Odysseus. And, you know, that's why he thought of the Trojan horse, you know, and he thought of all the ways that he could, for example, navigate through Scylla and Charybdis. And, you know, his wiliness and his cunning are a real key part of that. And the kind of guilt and worry, to me, kind of played against that a bit and maybe undermined that very heroic part of him that, you know, I felt in some ways it was... again, a bit of an attack on men. And we see that so much in culture these days, that male values and strengths are kind of undermined, and you know, you should feel bad about, you know, defending your way of life in the way that, you know, he would see that was what he was doing in the Trojan Wars. So I had some problems with it, but I did very much enjoy it as an experience and
that's right. It's a film you've got to see, really, isn't it?
It is, exactly.
I mean, something we've spoken about before is this idea of the death of the monoculture. So there was the idea being that throughout in the 20th century arose this monoculture, a sort of common reference point that everybody watched the same things and they knew of the same events, and so you might arrive at a party and not know people, but you had immediately something that you could talk about. And that has kind of died with the advent of social media and new forms, new mediums of information and entertainment. And this, for me, feels like whether it's like a last gasp of the monoculture or a return of the monoculture, it somehow feels like that, because over the last couple of weeks, people I've spoken to and random, you know, events I've been to, lots of people speaking about this film. And it comes in the same summer that we had a World Cup, where, and I don't remember this in any previous World Cup, so many non-football fans really got behind it. So many of my friends who just aren't interested whatsoever in football were watching the games with me and then texting each other about the games and learning about all the players. And I wonder if there's maybe that story isn't fully written yet about this idea of that we're all going to be living in microcultures, and maybe there will be fewer but some residual reference points going forward.
And that'd be a good thing.
Perhaps, yeah, to bind us together.
I think it's a good point. So when we saw it in the cinema, and next to us, well, one seat away, was a father and son, and that's quite a big theme in the film, of course, the father and son reunion. And this father and son, they were living the film. You know, sometimes you get annoyed at people sort of talking, but they were shouting out, "Come on, get him!" and you know, all the way through. And you know, even at the end, it's taken them a long time to get home. Okay, but there's a fair point. But there was this sort of running commentary, but you couldn't help but be engaged by it. It was so sort of attractive in a way, this relationship between father and son being lived out as they lived out the film. So you know, that was quite fun to you know, made for the enjoyment of the film for us.
Yeah, and there are some bits in the film. all I need to say is pigs. For anybody that's watched the film will know what I'm talking about, which was absolutely remarkable. One of the most sort of scenes I've ever seen, just where you really couldn't take your eyes off it. It was, incredible piece of cinema. So, David, what have you brought to Culture Club?
So I've been naughty. I bought two things, but one very quickly. So this is a quick one. This is Robo and their new single, Claw Machine. I have to express an interest. My nephew is a drummer, this band, but they're an up-and-coming band from York. They had their first play on national radio last week. And so I'd encourage listeners to check out Robo. But the main thing I wanted to talk about was this.
The 100.
Mm-hmm. And many of you will know, anyone who follows me on Twitter, my Twitter handle is Cricket Wyvern. And the Wyvern comes from Somerset. Traditionally, the Wyverns were the symbol of Somerset Cricket Club. And my formative years were in Somerset, and I've been a Somerset cricket fan for many years. And so the 100 is a very sensitive subject to me. For those of you who don't follow cricket, it's a new form of cricket. So you may have heard of T20, where you have 20 overs a side. And the 100 is where you have 100 balls for each side. So it's an even shorter form of the game. So you've got Test cricket that lasts 5 days, T20 maybe 3 hours, and now the 100 will last two hours. And it's been a real radical change. And for me, it's not a good cultural change for a couple of reasons. One is that the 100 has not just changed cricket. The idea is that you try and get a new group of people in, which cricket has always innovated, and the move to T20 did that. But this has been designed by marketers sitting in a room saying, we can't have overs because people don't know what an over is. So we'll call them a set, and there'll be 5 balls instead of 6 balls. We can't have, so changing the whole structure of cricket. So whereas the T20 was something that somebody who's a terrible cricketer like me will play in my church team, and we can understand with that, it's just a shorter form of the game. The 100 is trying to create something different. The other reason I'm concerned about it is because they decided to import the Indian Premier League concept of franchises, American sports, where you don't have it rooted in historic counties like Somerset, Surrey, Middlesex, Nottinghamshire.
Lancashire.
Lancashire, yeah. You have the Trent Rockets, or you have Northern Sunrisers. So you lose this link with people's, what people who want to support something they come from. And of course, it works to a certain extent. It gets some crowds in. But my thought is it gets crowds in because you've only got sort of, whatever it is, 8 teams instead of 18 counties. But also, they're ploughing so much into the marketing. And when the marketing stops, actually, I'm not sure this will really be sustained when they had a really good product already. And it's particularly sensitive for me as a Somerset supporter because there's no Somerset 100 team. You have to go up to where the closest one is Welsh Fire, who are based in Cardiff, or else Southern Braes, who I think are in Hampshire. There's nowhere near the West Country. And Somerset is a cricket county. Okay, it's got a rugby team at one end in Bath. There's no football team of real note. You've got Yeovil, who have been in the league for a little while, but are usually a non-league team. Somerset is a cricket county. It's really, they'll sell out that's lovely small ground at Taunton for county games. And the ECB are missing out. I think it's a cultural, moving into a cultural wasteland of the 100, and I really regret it.
I think that might be the first time anyone's brought something bad to Culture Club. Saying like this shouldn't be a part of the culture, but I appreciate it. I think that's for somebody that's not a cricket fan, I sort of understand where you're coming from, and I can certainly the idea of American franchising, it really resonates with me because I'm a big NBA fan. And some of the ways that they talk about it when they say that the player has to do this because it's part of the business and it's part of the the model, and I just think no, that's not the right way. It should be the sport should be the sort of the top of the hierarchy. There should be the sporting prowess rather than making money.
I hate the 100 as well. I thought you might not like it when you said you were going to bring it, but I didn't want to ask you in advance. Let me just give you one pushback that I think is quite an interesting aspect of it. So generally in cricket, the women's game and the men's game are very, very different, and they're played on different games in different grounds sometimes. And the thing that I thought was quite interesting about the 100 is that generally you have the women's game happens because they're quite very short. So you have the women's game and then you have a break, and you might have a band playing in the break, and then you have the men's game. And you might expect what happens then is that people turn up towards the end of the women's game, they don't really watch it. But actually what you found is that a lot of the crowd come and they watch both the women's game and the men's game. So can I just ask you to maybe respond to, is there something good
Absolutely.
about that?
I think that's great. And I used to coach, my daughter was in a girls cricket team. I used to coach girls cricket. I'm really enthusiastic about the women's game. I watch women's cricket a lot, mainly on the telly, to be honest. But that's fine. You have the double headers in the 100. But of course, you can do that in T20, and they do that in T20. So at Trent Bridge this year, we've had the Nottinghamshire men's team and the women's team playing in a double header. So you've had women's game and the men's game. So I think there's nothing that's happened in the 100 that you couldn't do with this fantastic product that has really taken off around the world and has reinvigorated cricket, T20, which, I still love Test cricket, but I think there's an absolute, I can see the role for T20s. It's still rooted in the county, so you're attached to something you really care about. It's a bit quicker, so it's a bit easier to introduce kids to. Great. That's a really good innovation, which doesn't lose the fundamentals of cricket, whereas 100 does. So I think there's nothing that the 100 does, including women's cricket, that you can't and haven't done in T20. That's what they should have pushed instead.
Okay. I do have a marketing idea for cricket teams for the counties. So the county matches that, I don't know what it's like near you, but, certainly at Old Trafford, the county matches are very, very poorly attended. So, I'm quite often walking past Old Trafford when there's a county match on and there's acres of empty seats. So my idea is they should let you take the dog.
Do they not let you take the dog?
No.
Okay.
No, only guide dogs allowed in Old Trafford. And I just think if I could take the dog, I would very happily spend a day watching county cricket and, maybe having a couple of beers, taking me sandwiches and, paying for a ticket for county cricket. But, it's because it's so long, it's hard to do it and to fit everything else in. So that's my alternative suggestion, marketing suggestion.
I think you should make that to the ECB. That's a very good idea, Hilary.
I will write in.
Very good. So the 100 cricket and the Odyssey Culture Club.
Yeah. And what's the band called again?
Robo, the band.
Robo. We'll have to send us a link so that we can include that in the show notes.
Great. And thank you for your time, David. It's been really enjoyable episode.
It's been a pleasure.
Great. And thanks for watching, everybody. As always, do recommend us to your friends and give us your top rating. And we will see you again soon.
Thanks for listening.